Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, Beshear makes the Times 100 Next list. I know obviously that happened last week, but I was off last week, and I want to talk about it, so we'll go over that story. And in Kentuckians making national headlines, Hadley Duvall, the abortion activist who has a powerful personal testimony, not really to deal with abortion, but rather to deal with sexual violence, rape, incest. A story certainly worth looking at was featured on the cover of Glamour magazine, as obviously the national media is trying to make this all about abortion, hence why they're pushing forward Beshear and Hadley Duvall. We'll dig into both those stories. And then the mayor in Louisville, Greenburg, goes ahead and says they're going to start reinforcing an ordinance banning masks in public spaces after an incident at a high school, shooting near a high school. We'll go over exactly that story and then also the reactions to it and just how unhinged and crazy people have become. So we'll be going over all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before I dig down into it, please make sure you like, comment, share, subscribe. Make sure you're pushing this out to other people, telling people, hey, tune on in, check out the Andrew Cooperrider Show. But without further ado, let's dig down into... Oh, right, before I forget, sorry, I almost forgot. If you want to reach out to the show, go ahead and email info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. You can also head on over to theandrewshow.com and hit the contact tab. But otherwise, let's dig down into it. So Beshear was featured in Times Next 100. Small little excerpt. I'll read what they said about him, why he got featured in their 100 Next, which is a list meant to kind of cover who's up and coming, who's going to become the star or what have you of the future. And while I understand what they're saying about Andy Beshear in this instance, because Andy Beshear is being used by Kamala Harris, we'll go into why, I think Andy Beshear's future, I think it depends a little bit here on whether or not Kamala Harris can win, and we'll go into that. But let's look at the Time 100 Next excerpt about him. So they said, when Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear won re-election last year in a deep red state, he did so through his convincing portrayal of post-partisan leadership. The Democrat spoke of one Kentucky and cited the Bible story of the Good Samaritan. Perhaps most importantly, he pointed to the billions in federal dollars that he brought to his rural state. So let's just pause right there, because I think Time 100 is correct. Beshear did win re-election for a few reasons. One is he did put forward a portrayal of post-partisan leadership, but also because, obviously, with the last name Beshear, and you have the Blue Dog Democrats that kind of switched over to being Republican, and so those areas that have historically, especially Eastern Kentucky, voted Democrat, but had shifted more red for national politics. If they were ever going to vote Democrat again, they would have voted for Beshear, because they'd voted for Beshear before, whether that's Andy Beshear or his dad Beshear. Because I want everybody to remember, and this is a hard thing I think a lot of people have a hard time comprehending, is that while many of people like myself, we've always been conservative. We've never been a registered Democrat. We've always kind of viewed the Republican Party or a conservative party as our home, as our place to be. Not everybody's fallen into that category. And especially in rural areas, for a long time, the Democrat Party was the default party. And a lot of that had to do with, historically speaking, unions. The Democrat Party was seen as the party of the unions, while, the Republican Party seen as the party of big business. And so therefore, in these rural areas where you had unions, and more importantly, you had like one employers or two employers, unions became very important because, and that's something that I talk about often, is that really unions per se, in large part, aren't as useful in many categories as they used to be, just simply because, you can find labor. Unions and labor laws were put in place in large part to protect, obviously, the worker, because you would have situations where a company would come into an area they would be the only employer in the area, the only place you could get a job, and literally finding another job was a very difficult and arduous task. I'm not talking about just picking up your life and moving, which has become even more easier. I'm just talking about literally finding out where do you go to work and how do you have a job when you show up there for sure. That was a hard thing to do. And so in large part in these areas where, maybe you just had the local coal mine was the main employer, well, really that was the only way you were going to get a job, was either working for the coal mine or some of the auxiliary jobs that the coal miners depended upon. And so a lot of these unions and labor laws came about in order to give the workers the ability to negotiate a little bit more in order to get higher wages. But in modern times, it's fairly easy to just find a job. And that really can protect a lot of the workers. And so I think that's why, generally speaking, private sector unions have kind of fallen off because the demand for them and the concern about workers isn't quite as large. But in these rural areas, unions were very popular. To give you a little history in Eastern Kentucky, and I think part of the reason why the red shift started to happen right around the time it did, especially for national politics, deals with there was some situations where the coal mines in Eastern Kentucky, for an example, were like poisoning the water, and they were able to declare bankruptcy and get out of having to fix those problems that they would normally be held account to. And the government basically stepped in and allowed them to get out of it, and that severely hurt some of these Eastern Kentucky areas. And I think that's kind of what made them say, oh, okay, so the Democrat government can step in and will still favor the big businesses if given enough money. So therefore, we're not necessarily nationally going to vote Democrat. But locally, they'd been Democrat for a long time. It's kind of just a historical tradition. You're a Democrat, that's what you do. You register as a Democrat. Well, that shift started to occur even locally. And as Donald Trump came in and the Republican Party had a reshift, and especially too, as the Democrats even locally started to chant the LGBTQ leftist cultural mantras, that really turned off a lot of the more traditionally socially conservative individuals in these rural areas. And so you saw this realignment of the area, and a lot of people who were registered Democrat started voting Republican. And then sometimes they'd switch a registration, sometimes they won't. And that's how you have counties in rural areas that are majority registered Democrats, sometimes by a lot, that still end up with Republican county leadership. I believe there's a county in western Kentucky, it just gave me which one, and I remember this from the campaign trail, that was 75% Democrat, 25% Republican, but yet had an all-Republican fiscal court because while people were registered Democrat, they just voted Republican. That's just what they did. And so keeping that in mind, that, somebody being a Democrat doesn't necessarily make a lot of these voters, especially new Republican voters, view them as somebody they'll never vote for. And so Andy Beshear, being a Democrat, the voter situation and mindset being what it is, was able to go ahead and grab a hold of that mindset. And because he's a Beshear, a lot of them had voted for Beshear before. They're not turned off from voting for a Democrat. They went ahead and voted for a Democrat. Now, granted, nobody else is going to have the unique appeal Andy Beshear does, unless, of course, Andy Beshear's son comes into play. Andy Beshear obviously being in office currently, Andy Beshear having the last name Beshear, that helps him. And I don't think any other Democrat governor will win after Beshear until somebody from one of these other families can come into office in a time where a lot of these voters who still remember voting for their dads and granddads are still able to vote, are still around to vote. Unless somebody comes in, I think the Democrats are going to have a real hard time winning a lot of elections in Kentucky. But putting that to the side, Time said that he provided convincing portrayal. And it was in large part convincing because, quite frankly, the Kentucky GOP and the McConnell structure absolutely sucks at winning elections. They do not know how to combat things. The first problem is they always start too late. And I bring this up, and people could say, it's not helpful to bring this up now. But if we don't bring this up and we don't talk about it, they're going to keep making these mistakes statewide. And we're seeing them make the mistakes right now with Amendment 2, voting yes on Amendment 2, getting that amendment passed. the general thought process is we're not going to really start up our campaigning until the final month, because that's when we think people are finally paying attention. We don't think it's worthwhile to spend money there. But when you sit down and you take a look at the results from how they've campaigned just over the last decade, what you see is that when you have an incumbent, in order to win, you have to spend a lot of money. They spend a lot more than they should have to as the incumbency. And then when they're trying to take on a hard race, like trying to take on a seated incumbent or trying to win a difficult primary where the other person, they're not as well funded, but they have enough that people know who they are, they lose almost every single time. No, they should learn how to start early. In fact, what's interesting is before really the McConnell actors, I'm talking about people like Scott Jennings, who, obviously is in that McConnell orbit. He's a commentator on CNN, but for those of you who aren't aware, he also operates a consultancy here in Kentucky and does a lot of work on different campaigns. And he was working on Cameron's campaign. And then also you had Mitch McConnell's chief of staff, Terry Carmack, came in to work on the campaign. But what's funny is when they weren't as involved in the campaign in the primaries, and I'm just saying I know this from being around, they were not as involved in the campaign during the primaries. Cameron was kind of using some different people. Cameron did something very smart early on, and he got Donald Trump's endorsement, basically making it to where all he had to do was he got out and head, and then he just had to hold on to it. Sure, they pushed a lot during the last month, but even leading up to that, they did do a long runway of going ahead, getting that endorsement early, having those press opportunities early, and getting after it early. But when it came to the general election, it's like the McConnell people came in, they took over, and in large part, they were quiet up until a month and a half out. And you would think that they'd start to look around and realize what they're doing isn't working. You cannot just wait to the last month. One, voting's longer. And then two, of course, people are deciding to make up their minds earlier and getting into camp. As we become more partisan, as we become more divided, and as information has flown more freely online, Twitter and Facebook and things, and as more voters have come online, you have to get out there early. You have to paint the narrative early before anybody else can get to it. That's incredibly important, in my opinion, and I do not think the McConnell campaign gets the McConnell group and those groupies and those types of campaigners. I don't think they understand it. Now you can say, Andrew, what do you know? You've lost elections. I have, but I tell you what, we put up more of a fight than they were expecting with a lot less money than the other people had. Every election I've lost, the other people have had to outspend me 5-1, 6-1, 7-1. And a lot of times in those situations where they're outspending me by that level, we're still winning larger shares of the vote than anybody expected, even with them spending that much. And it's because, hey, we can effectively campaign with less money. Now, we may need a little bit more to be able to compete in some of these situations where you just run into it. But then you turn around and you look at what I'm talking about, this earlier starting of campaigning and going ahead and making sure you're out there shaping the viewpoint of people. And we can look at races like the House race primary from Kim Holloway versus Richard Heath. Kim Holloway had been campaigning for 2 years. Richard Heath didn't even bother to start campaigning until a few weeks out, and he gets defeated as a quote-unquote powerful incumbent because he wasn't out there preparing and making sure to create that image like Kim Holloway was. So you see, every time people are winning hard elections, they're getting out there early. But that's not in the McConnell-type campaigning features. And that's why, too, on this Amendment 2 side of things, the school choice amendment, I'm worried about who's running that because they have waited till this long. Now they're an uphill battle. The Amendment 2 crowd has been absolutely ferocious in making sure they get out op-eds and news stories and get as many people out there talking about it as possible. Meanwhile, the pro-Amendment 2 people, they haven't done that. Just period, they haven't done it. Rand Paul's come the closest to the people that are getting out there to talk about it. He's talked about it once or twice. His wife's getting out there a little bit and talking about it. But they should be having people out there talking about this constantly. They should be having people writing just as many op-eds as the left does. They should have people in every area talking, being the media contact for this, talking about this and having conversations about it. But instead, you log into your newspapers, you log into even your local news, your nightly news. You do a search online, and what you see is whether it's coordinated or motivated attack against Amendment 2. And if it fails, and I don't feel too good about it, so if it fails, it'll be because didn't even bother trying to campaign until a month out, and then you're trying to motivate everybody, and it's not there. I'm telling you, I'm out driving around. I see not just in Lexington, but in all over, and I'm seeing vote yes, vote no on 2 signs all the time, and I don't know if I've seen a vote yes on 2 sign yet. So it just kind of gives you some idea there. But we continue in the Times 100. Took a big turn there because I wanted to point out that Beshear's convincing portrayal of post-partisan leadership, as Time called it, is only convincing because the Cameron camp never even bothered to attack it. Never even bothered to talk about just how partisan Beshear is, because he is, without a doubt. I wouldn't just call him the most partisan governor we've had in quite some time, but the most, if you don't do for me, I'm not doing for, I mean, that's just how the Beshear family's operated. If you want them to do for you, you better do for them. You better scratch their back, and then maybe they'll scratch yours. You better be a big donor. You better be moving the money for them. It's not enough to just be a Democrat for them. You also have to be in their good graces. And so I just think that the convincing portrayal is only convincing because nobody bothered to poke holes in this, just how partisan he is, just how far left he is, and pointing out, and look, the ways I would have pointed it out quite honestly is by talking about things he's spending money on, things he's approving, things I talk about all the time. There's easy ways to have done that. They failed to do that. But we continue in this little article here. So it's surprised no one this summer when Beshear, the most popular Democrat governor in the nation, made Kamala Harris's short list as a potential running mate. The scion of Kentucky Democrats' most formidable family, he has managed to lead his conservative state even as a Republican supermajority at the state house routinely sends him veto-destined legislation, delivering on big ideas like legalizing medical marijuana and expanding Medicaid to cover vision and dental care, and his commitment to reproductive rights has been as steady as his presence during a slate of floods and tornadoes, making the 46-year-old Beshear a winner of praise well beyond Kentucky. So that's what they finish off with. And also the big ideas like legalizing medical marijuana, expanding Medicaid to cover vision and dental care. You know, once again, this just goes into the fact that Republicans don't have a courage of convictions. Maybe you, or Republicans don't. Maybe you agree with medical marijuana. Maybe you don't. Maybe you agree with some of his expansions. Maybe you don't. But one thing can be true is that in large part, especially take medical marijuana, the legislature had to pass a law. So basically Beshear kind of did it. And then the legislature went along with it after he did it. And granted, a lot of that is to do with maybe they were already kind of thinking about it. But still, you know, allowing Beshear to misuse his powers, we're seeing it now when it comes to the ban conversion therapy. And I know there's some court actions over that, but the ban conversion therapy, for an example, those executive actions holding him accountable. But, you know, for all we know, we're going to see Republicans in this state and this legislature pass a law halfway codifying what he put into place and giving him a victory to be able to see what I did? I got banning conversion therapy done in a Republican state. Look at me. I can lead in the most partisan state, because that's exactly the kinds of things that we see Republicans doing. Now, as far as his future goes, I don't know if Beshear has much of a future. I'm in between on this, because his hard part is to stay relevant for the next 3-4 years. Because if Kamala Harris wins, he obviously could become a cabinet member, and he could be somewhat relevant over the next 4 to 8 years as a cabinet member. Outside of Pete Buttigieg, though, I don't know who else. I mean, in Biden's cabinet, who has remained highly relevant in his cabinet, like in a positive note? And really, when you think about his circle and his advocates and people talking for him, you think of like John Kerry, but he's not really a part of his cabinet. He's like the climate change envoy. And so that's a difficult situation for Beshear. So if, let's say, they go ahead and make him, I don't know, transportation secretary or even attorney general, maybe that would make him more relevant. but it'd just be difficult. My point is that even with Kamala Harris winning, and if she stays in for 8 years, well, then he can become relevant, I guess, through being a cabinet head, but he's going to have to be able to carve out his own star. Very difficult for him to do, and that's no guarantee he even makes the cabinet. Now, if Kamala Harris doesn't win, obviously he can start running for president in 4 years. He's kind of gotten some hits in the media coverage and everything else, but he has to hope that that continues, because if, however, Kamala Harris loses and he's gearing up for a run in 2-3 years, well, he has to remain relevant. But the only reason the media is talking to him now is because he is a Kamala Harris surrogate, specifically on the abortion issue as well. And so that leads us to Hadley Duvall, who ended up on the cover of Glamour talking about abortion. In an article, Woman of the Year 2024, the abortion activist turning pain into power. And I want to read to you the beginning of this article. And I want to talk about this specific story here, because I understand it's difficult for people who are pro-life to talk about this situation because they don't want to be castigated as uncaring or angry, or it's just uncomfortable to handle it. But I think we do need to have a discussion, and I've kind of talked a bit about this in the past, but I think it's worth digging into what Hadley Duvall's story is really about. And in the past, I've talked about how this constant from her of having to relive this trauma over abortion rights when her story really isn't even about abortion, it must just be soul grinding. And because it's just so terrible, but abortion doesn't even really play a part into her story. And I want to read Glamour's push out there, and they never really asked the question about how does abortion come into play here when you actually know the story. But let me read just these first few paragraphs. Before she knew what a miscarriage was, Hadley Duvall experienced one. She was 12. Sitting on the toilet in her childhood home in Owensboro, Kentucky, and racked with a level of pain she'd never felt before, Hadley watched the blood, so much blood, pour out of her body and knew it was bad. She wondered if this would be it. Maybe she thought she'd bleed out. She'd die right here, and then she'd be free of this whole mess. That could be the best case scenario. Down the hall, her mother slept soundly. Hadley wanted to scream to her, to cry for help. She needed her mother in the visceral way you do when you're in the throes of deep emotional or physical pain, but she couldn't. If her mother woke up and saw her hunched over the toilet, experiencing something that Hadley couldn't name but knew wasn't just a normal period, what would she think? Then what if her mother woke him up, Hadley's abuser, the man who had been raping her since she was 5 years old? In the night while her mother slept, who told her that she was his addiction, just as her mother had struggled with substance abuse. The man, when he had told her to take a pregnancy test a few weeks earlier, and it was positive, ordered her to try to self-induce a period with her fingers, and when that obviously didn't work, told her to make a choice between having an abortion or pretending that one of her middle school friends was the baby's father. The man who was her stepfather, who had raised her since she was a toddler, and whom she called Dad. Hadley played through the scenario in her mind. Her abuser had guns in the house. If she woke everyone up, would he see it as a threat? Would he kill them all, her mother, her older siblings, and herself, to avoid the consequences? No, it was too risky. So Hadley sat for hours waiting. Finally, she drew herself a bath, making the water as hot as it could go. She scrubbed her entire body to get rid of the germs, to get rid of it all. Then she went back to bed. A few days later, she's back at middle school. She pretended it never happened, but she didn't forget. She couldn't forget. So for those of you who had never heard Hadley Duvall's story, there it is. Just kind of giving some of that out there. And reading through the story, the first thing that strikes me is, if anything, the story, at best, the story has nothing to do with abortion. Because obviously Hadley Duvall didn't get an abortion. And what caused her victimization, what caused her to be in this horrific hell that she was living in, had nothing to do with abortion. Abortion rights, one way or another, wouldn't have helped her. If anything, abortion being allowed at the time may have actually hurt her, because it gave an opportunity for her piece of trash stepfather, who's barely human and deserves nothing but endless pain, to be able to inflict this kind of abuse on her, knowing that if something happened, like a pregnancy, well, it could go away as easy as an abortion, especially if it was in a situation where it's a no questions abortion that many of these leftist states have, where a stepfather could bring in his 12-year-old daughter to get an abortion and never face any consequences for the sexual abuse because they're not going to ask about it. They're not going to dig into it at all when there's obvious abuse going on. So it's not really, if anything, when you look at her story and when you have these kinds of stories, and this is why I say it's soul grinding, because you would find that finding redemption in this situation should be, talking about how I came to discover myself, how I moved on after this, but then also advocating for things that could prevent these situations. But abortion doesn't prevent her from being, abortion access doesn't prevent her from being raped at 5 years old. Abortion access doesn't prevent her from getting pregnant at 12. If anything, abortion access, like I said, kind of can help enable this. No. Instead, when I read this story and I look through it, I think about a lot of things. I think about how the mother had this going on, whether she knew or didn't know, for 7 years. 7 years. This guy was raping her daughter. And she either knew and didn't care, or she didn't know. Which that would begin to have a question here. Why didn't she know? Now, we get some evidence of that when they talk about her mother having to deal with addiction. Which that would mean this is a story about the consequences and problems of addiction. That the mother was so addicted to drugs that she didn't even notice her 5-year-old daughter was being raped. That is a story of how do we prevent this from happening. But here's the other thing. I read through this and I wonder, and it goes into a lot, I think, about abortion, and that is, where was her biological father? Because obviously, even if she was only seeing her father once every other week, on the weekends even, or, even if her father had split custody and 50-50 timeshare, well, then she would have somebody that she's not worried about being necessarily harmed or injured per se. When she's talking about her mother and bringing it to her mother, and the reasons why she didn't tell her mother about it, because of her addiction or other things, you'd argue that she would have another person she could have talked to, somebody who loves her, somebody who is there for her. Now, I did my best to figure out where was Hadley Duvall's biological father, and I searched through tons of articles, and you would think that if you're trying to understand the story and you're trying to say, how do we prevent this, you would look at that and say, well, a lot of this problem that we see in society, the step parents, raping children, is not entirely uncommon. Sexual relationships between step children and parents, in fact, is such I guess you'd call it a thing in people's mind, that is one of the, if not the, most popular porn categories out there. I mean, there's jokes about stepsister, stepdaughter, stepmother, whatever, porn in our modern media today. So it's a common porn category, and it's obviously something to be aware of that's happening, that this whole step-parent, step-family interactions. Now, I'm not saying that biological parents never rape or commit incest or do horrible things to their children. I'm not saying that at all, but obviously there not being a blood relation leads to predators having more, these kinds of predators to have opportunities here where they can hook up with single moms in order to go after their children or and victimize their children. It's an obvious opportunity. So I set about doing something that I found out no one who has looked into the story has asked, which is, where was her biological father? In fact, I searched and I searched and I searched, and the only thing I could find was from one article that just casually mentioned that Hadley Duvall's father was absent. They never dig into why he was absent. Was he on drugs? Was he not there? Did the mother push him away? What have you? And so I look at this story and I say, part of the way, if we want to prevent this from happening, which I do, I don't think abortion and making a victim of this an abortion rights activist, a prolific one, is the way we solve any of this. The way we solve this is by talking about the important roles, especially biological fathers have in their children's life, about taking accountability. In fact, I would say, if anything, this constant push on abortion rights and abortion access and saying it's a woman's right to choose and all these other things that, this isn't an independent child with two parents at the time that it's in the mother's womb, that push actually devalues the father's position, that the father isn't important at all, and tells the father that, hey, it's the woman's choice to have a child. You had no decision in it, so feel free to abandon it. I think that push, that cultural belief that it is not your responsibility as a father to take care of your children is a big problem. Not only does it create these kinds of situations, but it also, and look, I literally don't know where the father was in this story. So I don't know if she would have been better off with her biological father. I mean, it's hard to make those claims and you can argue about it all day long. But what we do know for a fact when we look at the grand scheme of things is that children who are with their biological mothers and fathers do far better in every single category of success and are less likely to be victims of even this kinds of situation. Not that it can't happen, but a lot less likely. Obviously, you can't be a victim of your stepfather raping you if you never have a stepfather. So in every single one, almost every metric though, a child whose mother and father are both in their life does better than a child that doesn't have that situation. And so if you want to talk about preventing these situations, not to repeat my point, but just to sum it up, being an abortion rights activist, if anything, it only perpetuates more of these situations to occur. If we don't want stories like Hadley Duvall's to happen, instead of advocating for women to be able to kill their children, maybe we should be advocating for biological fathers to fulfill their roles in the household, advocating that children have a responsibility from both parents to raise it from the moment of conception. But that conversation about parents being together, raising children, that's not a conversation the left wants to have. Because that's a conversation about personal responsibility. That's a conversation where the government isn't solving problems for you. No, the conversation they want to have is rather about how government can protect your right, whatever that means, to kill your children. Moving on now, final story here we have coming out of Louisville. Mayor Craig Greenburg put in place a mask ban of wearing masks. Interesting change. Let's take a listen here. This is a news story from WHAS 11 talking about this renewed mask ban enforcement. Let's take a listen to that. And then I want to read some of the comments. Let's dig into it.
Mayor Craig Greenburg says the suspects who shot two teenage boys near the PRP football game Sunday night wore surgical masks to cover their face. Now he wants police to start enforcing a 40-year-old ordinance about masks. The ordinance became relaxed during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it prohibits people from wearing any mask that hides or covers a portion of the face in a public place inside Jefferson County. Greenburg says he recognizes the limitations this law possesses, especially for those who want to wear a mask for COVID protection, for Halloween costume, or for the upcoming fall season. He assured residents personal and public health will be considered, but pointed out recent crime numbers have made gun violence far too common.
This is a public health emergency that we must deal with. And when there are tools that we have that we can use to reduce the amount of gun violence, it is critically important that we take every action to implement them.
I actually want to pause right there. When he first started off, when I first heard the story and then first started off, I thought they were replaying an old story where he was talking about face masks being required in public to compare that to like what's going on now. I didn't expect that he was talking now about gun violence being a public health crisis. And really, ever since COVID, every single thing that the government has to address has become a public health crisis, as they would call it. And I think realistically, we should call it what it is. It's a crime problem. It's not a public health crisis. A public health crisis would imply that if we just, eat right, exercise, take the right medicine, see the doctor, we could solve these problems. But, smoking is a public health crisis. Not everything's a crisis either, but violence is one, so I won't say it's not. But, smoking is creating a public health crisis. Okay, well, you solve that by not smoking. You solve these problems by personal individuals making better choices in many public health, quote unquote, situations and crises. Obesity, a public health crisis. People need to make better decisions, period. But to call gun violence a public health, that's a weird way to phrase it. Maybe he's doing it because he's trying to explain how removing masks is now a public health thing instead of keeping them on. But still, it's just a weird way to describe it. Problem with it, but we continue in the story.
Those who violate this law could be fined or jailed $100 or even jailed up to 50 days or both. And today, LMPD Chief Paul Humphrey spoke more on this mask crackdown, saying the department is seeing more and more instances of people committing crimes while wearing masks.
We understand there are legitimate health reasons why people wear masks, but we also understand there are people who are taking advantage of that. And they are using masks to conceal their identity in order to prey on the community. And we see it time and time again. If you're telling me that somebody is standing around in a hoodie and gloves and a mask covering their face, outside lurking in the shadows, has a legitimate health concern, I would probably beg to differ.
The chief went on to say it's all about the totality of the circumstance. The department is not going out there just targeting anybody wearing a mask.
So obviously this is a good move, and it really shouldn't need to be debated. It should be quite obvious that, hey, maybe if you're having crime and criminals, they want to cover their masks, and maybe, especially once, CDC and others have kind of come out saying that cloth masks, surgical masks specifically, and cloth masks are not helpful, that if you need to wear masks for some disease reason, COVID or what have you, even the CDC says, not saying I believe it, but just based upon what the CDC says, you need to wear an N95 mask. Well, then that should be, obvious. If you're not wearing an N95 mask, that should be of concern. And especially in this day and age, how many people are still wearing masks for COVID? Not very many. There are some, obviously. And clearly, allowing criminals to wear masks while they're out and about does provide more opportunity. I mean, this is just like a basic thought process that you think wouldn't need any explanation, but I have to explain this because of what the comments on this were. Now, you'd think common sense would tell you that, most crimes are crimes of opportunity, and if you're providing people the opportunity to, as the chief of police said, leave their house wearing gloves, a mask, and a hoodie up to conceal their identity, they're a lot more likely to be committing crimes and be willing to commit crimes than if you leave your house looking like that, you could get stopped right away saying, hey, what are you doing? What are you up to? Because, if you can just wear a mask and gloves around, maybe you set out that day saying, I'm not going to commit any crimes. But because you are a person with no values, no scruples, and you're the type of person that commits crimes, you may turn around and look and say, well, I've got this mask, got these gloves on, maybe I'll just go ahead and take this. And so that's what you do, providing crimes of opportunities. That's most of what stealing is, crimes of opportunities. And profiling, people talk about profiling being a problem. Profiling's not always a problem. Sometimes you should look at a young, specifically male, individual, doesn't really matter their skin color, but if they're young and male and they're wearing masks and gloves and a hoodie up, they're probably up to no good. This should be self-explanatory, and giving a reason to be able to stop that individual and hopefully prevent that crime is certainly reasonable. But the comments would not have you believe this. So this is from comments on Mayor Greenburg's post about this. Let me read some of these. No citizen should be criminalized, marginalized, targeted, questioned, etc. for protecting their health. This is exactly what will happen. An innocent citizen will now carry a burden of proof / be forced to disclose medical information to police. Now, not only is this just a ridiculous comment to make that, yes, as I just said, young men walking around doing this, they don't need to do it. But also, can I not remind you what 2020 was like? That if you walked around not wearing a mask, you were criminalized, marginalized, targeted, and questioned for protecting your health. There were people out there who had real medical exemptions for the reasons they couldn't wear masks. Or there was a breathing problem. They were, maybe nonverbal, maybe other issues that they had. That wearing a mask affected their health. And they had actual letters saying that, hey, I can't wear a mask. But if they walked into a place without wearing a mask in 2020, they had to carry around a burden of proof and be forced to disclose their medical information or be arrested if they refused to leave by police if they didn't disclose their own medical information. But yet I bet you this commenter who's defending why young men need to walk around wearing masks and gloves and hoodies for, health reasons would be the first person to demand that individuals mask up and demand to read and say that, stores should kick them out unless they have a medical excuse, and that medical excuse has to be provided by a doctor. Obviously. Here's the next one. This one's truly dumb comment. This mask ban will not help curb gang violence. You're just getting in the way of people trying to protect themselves. I'm not interested in missing work because I'm sick. I'm not interested in having long-term issues from COVID. We still have murderers in this city. Yes, we do still have murderers in Louisville. And why is that? Because they can't be identified. That's what that news story was just covering. That there was a murder, a shooting outside of a school, and they can't identify who is committed those crimes because the individuals were wearing masks. Yes, you have murderers who are getting away with it, and criminals who are getting away with it because they're able to wear masks to hide their identity. What do you mean this will not help curb gang violence? No, it's probably not super accurate when it comes to gang violence that necessarily they will suddenly say, well, I guess I won't go shoot that guy now because I can't wear a mask. But if they're not allowed to just casually wear a mask and they see somebody, maybe they don't shoot them because they can't hide their identity. But then if they do, they can be identified and then sent to jail. And now there's one less criminal on the street to commit crimes. This is a simple thing. But of course, I have to explain why, maybe allowing people to wear masks around all the time isn't the great idea when it comes to crime problems. Something we never had to explain prior to COVID. It was just, this ordinance was on the books, accepted, generally enforced as a reason to stop somebody at least, until COVID. And now, suddenly, 4 years later, this law is just unworkable, impossible, absolutely ridiculous. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today. See you back here tomorrow. Hope you have a great rest of your day.